Well, good morning. Good morning. I want to welcome you to Southern Seminary on this beautiful Thursday morning. We're doing things a little bit differently today. We would typically have a sermon from our president, Dr. Moeller, but he decided that the events unfolding in the Middle East are of a significant nature that we would pivot and turn this into a Henry Institute Forum, which I'm privileged to lead here on the campus of Southern Seminary. And we're going to be discussing all of the events that have transpired over the last 4 and 5 days. And to have this conversation, I'm joined by dear colleagues of mine. I've got Ayman Ibrahim to my left, and he is the Bill and Connie Jenkins Professor of Islamic Studies, and he's the director of the Jenkins Center for the Christian Understanding of Islam. Next to him is Dr. Schreiner, who is the James Buchanan Harrison Professor of New Testament Interpretation and Professor of Biblical Theology. And then last we have Dr. Moeller, obviously the president of Southern Seminary. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to direct them to particular panelists, but we're going to kind of have a conversation as well. So it's going to be kind of free-flowing. But the very first question I want to ask to the panel, I'm going to begin with Dr. Moeller, is everyone in here is aware of the conflicts that have happened in the Middle East for decades, centuries it seems at this point. But a lot of us still find it confusing. So Dr. Moeller, would you kind of give us a brief historical sketch of what has transpired that brought us to today? What is the nature of the Middle Eastern conflict?
Oh, I'll do my best. I appreciate the question and the necessity of it. But being concise is extremely difficult in this situation, because in order to talk about what we now face, we have to go back at least to the 18th century. Before that, we won't go back, all the way to the book of Acts, but before that, you basically had the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic empire with a caliphate and later a sultanate in Istanbul, in control of this entire area of the world. The Ottoman Empire began to lose its traction, and European imperial powers began to move in. And there were two in particular, Britain and France. And Napoleon, very much a part of the French colonial expansion into the Levant, what some people would call Palestine later. And so you had a war of European nations basically for influence. But what you didn't have was the nation state the way we think of it now. We think of a map, a globe, we look at nation states and we say, well, we understand what that means. You can have a flag if you're a member of the United Nations, we know who you are. Nothing quite like that. There were Jewish people, the Mizrahi, who had been in the land of promise all the time. Not all the Jews left with the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the Jews. There were Jews who were there, and you also had shifting sands. I mean, and in particular, I didn't mean that as the metaphor it actually serves to be. And much of this is desert, but you had the fall of Napoleon, and thus the British gained a great deal of that territory. So right now, when there is a conflict in the Middle East, if it has to do with Lebanon, that invokes France. That's why, recent tragedy in Lebanon, it was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who responded with aid because France has a special relationship there. Britain had a relationship with Egypt and indeed an international mandate at one point to govern as the governing authority. So long as that mandate was in place, you had Jewish peoples, you had Palestinian peoples, and you had Palestinian Christians, as well as Muslims in Palestine. You also had a Muslim authority there known as the Grand Mufti. Now you fast forward and you have, beginning in Britain, a theory of the necessity of a Jewish state. You have the development of the Balfour Declaration connected to Arthur Balfour in the 19th century. You have British statesmen, some of whom you'll recognize names like Winston Churchill, who by the late 19th century was an advocate for a Jewish state there in what would later be called, and an attempted neutrality called Palestine. It's very offensive to the Jewish people today to call it Palestine, but we'll just say the land of promise to the Jewish people. And but you had two world wars. The Grand Mufti sides with the Nazis in World War II. So the Ottoman Empire falls apart. Then the Grand Mufti has to leave. And so it's kind of a chaos. And so the British Empire is responsible for that chaos. That's the chaos out of which the state of Israel came. And because of the Holocaust in the 20th century and the recognition of the historical horrors perpetuated against the Jewish people, a right of return, which had been articulated in the 19th century in English, became a motivating issue. And it also became a driving issue among many of the Jewish people who had survived the Holocaust and others who were in the United States. And so there was this mass return, and that's the word, the mass return to what we now know as Israel, but it wasn't the state of Israel yet. Reflecting what had happened in the horrors of the especially 19th and 20th century, pogroms, genocide, the United Nations in Resolution 181 in 1947 established what was called a partition of the area there. And there was to be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, in theory. And so this is moving forward, but there was also a great Jewish push for an end to the British mandate and a great struggle. And in 1948, the British basically withdrew. At that point, the Jewish leaders wanting to establish a Jewish state declared the Jewish state. They had authorization of the United Nations, which of course is only about 3 years old. They had the authorization of the United Nations to establish a state of Israel. There was also to be a state that would be a Palestinian state, side by side Israel in the same area. The point is, the Israelis declared a state and were able to put together a state. They had to fight a war of independence for that state. The Arab peoples in the area did not, that's not exactly the right word. The non-Jewish people in the region did not want to see, the Arab states did not want to see a Jewish state. And so Israel has had a succession of wars just to fight for its national existence. Most importantly, 1967, 1973, Israel had to fight to defend itself and ended up occupying territory that was not a part of the original partition for Israel. The Arab nations around Israel did not want the Palestinian people. And so there has been a sense in which the Palestinian people have been trapped between Arab nations that did not want them. Most importantly, you can see right there, Transjordan, Jordan, the nation of Jordan, which is a Hashemite kingdom. The dynasty there is Hashemite. The population there is like 90% Palestinian, and that's a big problem for Jordan. And so when you look at the current blockade of Gaza, this is very much a part of the context right now of this Hamas attack. Gaza's been blockaded not only by Israel, but also by Egypt. So it is certainly true that the Palestinian people they've experienced, and I don't mean the leadership, I mean the people, they have experienced deprivation, statelessness, frustration. It's largely been an ungovernable situation, though. The Palestinians have been unable to muster a government or to establish a state. There are factions, and the big issue that has changed is that Israel, having occupied these territories, now has, I would argue it had to. It was forced to by war. It is also forced to, at least to some extent, by the fact that these territories include many Palestinians who do not accept, most people would say the majority, do not accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel. They will not be satisfied to see the return to the 1948 lines. Hamas in particular, and Ayman will explain this better, Hamas, as its charter, the current leadership, which was elected by the people there in Gaza, in elections that are outdated, but they're still the last election, they're calling for the non-existence of Israel. So Israel is surrounded by people who are determined to achieve its non-existence. And it's determined to exist. And so we have a state in Israel which is a democratic society that shares most Western norms, surrounded by peoples, most of whom do not accept those norms and do not accept its existence. So what looks to many people in the United States like Israeli belligerence is, to the Israelis, a way of life in order to preserve the existence of the state and the lives within it. The breakdown of leadership amongst the Palestinians has been tragic. One of the most tragic aspects of this is that you have basically an Islamist terrorist group that was elected by the people of Gaza as their representatives. And so that's what Israel faces. And the attack that took place beginning on Saturday morning was undertaken by Hamas. The goal is not, according to Hamas, to bring about, say, an improvement in Palestinian conditions, but also to bring an end to the state of Israel, and with a brutality that Israel has not seen since the Holocaust of the 20th century.
Dr. Ibrahim, would you add anything to that from a historical perspective of what you know, Middle East? Okay. So put this in historical significance. What's the magnitude of what occurred on Saturday? I woke up, got my coffee, began scrolling Twitter, and began figuring out something big has been going on. In my own lifetime, I was only 4 years old, but I can measure. We look at the Berlin Wall coming down as a major moment in world history, 9/11 a major moment. Is what occurred on Saturday and what's going to transpire out of Saturday, is this an event of that magnitude? I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel your perspective on this.
Well, Israel never declared a state of war for the last 50 years until now. So this is a big event, and I don't think this war will be a two-day war. It will continue for some time.
Israel has had to fight for its existence from the very beginning. It has to fight for its existence every day. This has led to situations that you have skirmishes, you have terror attacks, you have rockets fired on Israel. I mean, their Iron Dome defense system, which is in cooperation with the United States in terms of technology, it's operative sometimes many times a week. But this is an existential threat to Israel. This is a threat the likes of which has not happened at least since the 1960s, the 1970s, when you had a coalition of Arab nations trying to bring an end to Israel. And so, yeah, for Israel, this is an existential threat. They understand it. This is a test they're going to have to win or they will not survive. The great danger for Israel is that you have not only Hamas, they're close to the south, but you have Hezbollah, another Iranian-linked militia there in Lebanon in the north, or you have other Arab states. Well, let me not say other Arab states. You have any Arab state join in this effort against Israel. At this point, it is unlikely those Arab states join, but Israel in a pincer maneuver between Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north is a challenge they haven't really seen since the coalition of Arab nations against them.
Thank you. We are very blessed to have Dr. Ibrahim on faculty here, and he really is regarded as one of the foremost Christian scholars of Islam in the world. And he has been writing excellent columns at World Opinions, and I think he's going to continue writing excellent columns at World Opinions because of what's happening right now. And so I want to ask you this question. What is the history and kind of the theological motivations of Hamas? What's going on in their mind to bring them to engage in the types of cruelty and barbarism that we've seen unfold?
Well, thank you so much for this. And to understand Hamas, we will briefly explain linguistically and politically and ideologically. So linguistically, the word Hamas in Arabic means rage with enthusiasm. So enthusiasm, but with rage. But this is not actually what the the word only means, because it's also an acronym that means the Islamic resistance, and this it's like a movement of Islamic resistance, particularly targeting the Jews. So some Palestinians want to live side by side with Israel, but Hamas does not want that. So for Hamas, it is linguistically the resistance to anything Jewish or related to the people of Israel. 2, politically, in the 1980s, after some countries in the Arab world joined peace treaties with Israel, like Jordan and Egypt, there was some Palestinians who really wanted to oppose that. And that's how they emerged as Hamas. Now, this is the political arena at that time. And they were actually in opposition to some Muslim Palestinians as well. So Hamas is not like only Palestinians, but actually some Palestinians don't endorse what Hamas does. So linguistically and politically, that's what we know about the early emergence of Hamas. Now, more importantly, ideologically, what is Hamas? Hamas is not only Islamic, it is actually more toward the political version of Islam. Let me explain. Islam is a set of rules and doctrines like any religion, okay? But there is one aspect or one disposition within Islam that we call political Islam or Islamism. What is that? It is the view that sees Islam as not only a religion, but a ruling power, a political power. This is Hamas. So Hamas is not really caring about going to pray in the mosque and just fast during Ramadan. No, it goes beyond that. For Hamas, Islam is not only a religion, but a political power. That's why they want to advance politics, they want to advance political power, and so forth. Now, Hamas is the little baby of a larger group that is called Muslim Brotherhood that emerged in Egypt in 1928. This is helpful for us as Christians to understand that this particular group is not really the normal kind of Muslim you meet here in the streets of Louisville. We see a lot of, I have Muslim friends here in Louisville. But Hamas is more of the type of, we want Islam to be dominant, to rule, and to advance. So by identifying these areas like linguistically and politically and ideologically, I hope this answers a little bit of the question.
Yeah, Ayman, you need to throw the category of jihad in this.
Of course, for Hamas, jihad is the most honorable deed they can do. What is jihad? Jihad is an armed fighting for the cause of Allah. According to the Quran and Muhammad's statements, this is the most honorable of a deed. I wrote actually a piece for Word about this, but the point is, it is a call to advance Islam as a ruling power through armed fighting. So this is in part what Islamism is about. So Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and actually we have some organizations worldwide that we can talk about that adopt this political Islam, and they don't really care that much about the regular Muslim. That's why we see Hamas using Muslims for the sake of advancement, their political gain.
So explain to us, though, how can such horrible atrocities occur? There were things that I'm not going to repeat on stage here that have been done to human beings in Israel. how can individuals find themselves in a position where they're willing to do unspeakably horrible things? What's at the root of this rage, this willingness?
I'll try to be very brief, but you can read the articles we have on the Jenkins Center website. If you read in the news and you see an elderly lady being dragged in a cart, like we read this in the New York Times yesterday, and a woman and her husband are trying to protect their children against fighters from Hamas, dragging them, and like very big atrocities happening. What is that? Many sane humans would not appreciate that, would not accept that, would condemn that. But Hamas has a different set of rules. Why? Because they are completely relying on the religious texts of Islam. So they look at the religious texts of Islam, the Quran, and they say, oh, wait, the enemy is the Jews. If the Quran states that, then we cannot deny that. And then they look at the biography of Muhammad, his life, and they see many incidents written in this sacred book for Muslims where Muhammad launched wars against Jewish tribes and settlements. So for these Islamists, political Islamic adherents of Islam, it's becoming more like I am imitating my role model. I am following the example of the most honorable person who ever lived for Muslims. This is why when the fighters of Hamas are executing these atrocities, they are not actually thinking they are doing something bad. They are doing a service for the divine, in their opinion, sanctifying and sanctioning these atrocities under the banner of religious texts. Make sense?
Dr. Schreiner, this question's for you. Is how should we be thinking about, as Christians, Old Testament Israel to Israel today as a geopolitical entity? Help us just think through the various categories theologically around that question.
Yeah, well, that's a very complicated question as well. And believers have different views on this, but I mean, we begin by saying, right, Israel's God's covenant people. God chose the Jews as his covenant people. And even when we come to the New Testament, Paul says, right, the gospel goes to the Jew first and also to the Greeks. So there's a sense in which even in the New Covenant era, there's a redemptive historical priority for the Jews. So, I mean, I don't know if you want me to sketch out all the views. I mean, maybe we don't have time for that. But what we see in the New Testament is we see a covenantal change taking place. So we see it in Ephesians 2 and 3 and other places where the people of God, so it's one people of God, Jew and Gentile together in one body. So my understanding is that the church, we don't have a replacement of Israel, but I think the Church of Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the promises to Israel. Then if we think of Israel today, the Jewish people, the ethnic Jewish people, how do we understand that? Well, a lot of it turns on a number of texts, but Romans chapter 11, verse 26, Paul says, all Israel will be saved. Well, what does that verse mean? Doug Moo, well-known commentator on Romans, I was with him on a panel. We were both asked, what's the most difficult text in Romans? And I didn't choose Romans 11:26. I chose Romans 7. But Doug chose Romans 11:26 as a very difficult verse to interpret. My understanding is there is a promise of future end-time eschatological salvation for the Jewish people as they put their trust in Jesus near the end of history. But then there are differences after that. I don't map that onto a political, national future, and many good Christians do. I don't see a political national future for Israel, either in the millennium or in the new creation. I see Israel becoming part of the church of Jesus Christ. I think in the new creation, there's lots of differences here. We'll all find out. But I don't think there's nations. I think there's one people of God. There's different peoples, but not nations. I don't see the Jews having any political supremacy of any kind, or even distinction.
So I can tell when Dr. Moeller has thoughts on something.
I
He
think
has thoughts right now.
I think he totally agrees with me.
Dr. Moeller, do you have thoughts, and what are those thoughts?
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with Dr. Schreiner. And I think, Tom, just between us for a moment, we just need to, let's just do this, the two of us, for a moment. So, you said you're not going to go into great depth, but I think it'd be good just to lay out how theological systems and eschatological understandings, hermeneutical systems of understanding the entire canon of Scripture, how those lay out. I think, you could do that in just a couple of minutes. I know you. So just kind of lay that out, because it matters if you're a classical dispensationalist, you look at this in one way. If you're an amillennialist, you look at it another way. Postmillennialists, historic premillennialists, who are the correct people, you can just lay that out.
Well, and if I can just even add to that, on Sunday evening, I got a text message from a dear brother in my church, and this brother said, are we living in the end times? Is this what happened on Saturday an aspect of biblical prophecy? And people are in the pews wondering how to think about this.
If you could just take a couple minutes to lay that out, I'll come back and differ with you a little.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we're definitely living in the end times, because 1 John 2 says it's the last hour. So we've been in the last hour for 2,000 years. Hebrews says we're in the last days. Are we in the last days of the last days? I think that's impossible to say, honestly. At least the way I understand New Testament eschatology, every generation has rightly thought this is probably the end. I think that is the way God has orchestrated his revelation, so that we say to ourselves, this is probably the end of time. I think that's how the Apostle Paul thought. I don't think he taught that, but I think he thought this is the end. Okay, a quick word. Maybe I could talk about it in terms of Romans 11, verse 26. So you have some, John Calvin, who say all Israel shall be saved, refers to the church of Jesus Christ, Jew and Gentile together. That's typically an amillennial view. There is no special place for the Jews in the millennium. There is not even a special place for Jews really after the time of the New Testament. There's no future salvation for the Jewish people. So that's a typical amillennial view. Historic premillennialists who believe there will be a millennium on earth, they are different from classical dispensationalists, because dispensationalists see, they hold to a rapture 7 years before the coming of Jesus. And then during that 1,000 years on earth, the millennium, the Jewish people have primacy as Jesus rules from Jerusalem. At least in my experience, historical dispensationalists, they don't focus on that primacy of Israel, but some sound more amillennial, some sound more dispensational. I think there's some wiggle room amongst the historical dispensationalists. Let's take
historical premillennialists.
Pardon?
Do you mean historic premillennialists?
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Not historic dispensationalists.
I mean historic premills.
Yeah,
some I think there's more of a future for ethnic Israel and some don't. I mean, a Ben Merkel, who I think is historic premill, maybe he's Amil, I'm not sure, who teaches at Southeastern, a graduate of our school. But Ben sees Romans 11:26 as saying all Israel will be saved. A remnant of Jews will be saved all through history. So for the last 2,000 years, some Jews are saved. But Ben sees no future salvation of ethnic Israel, no special place for Israel in the future. So, I don't know. I mean,
that's helpful.
Yeah.
That's helpful. But the point is that there are those who would look at this and say, I can tell you exactly where all this fits in biblical prophecy and the outlaying. My hermeneutic or way of interpreting scripture tells me I can draw a line from promises given to Israel to the formation of the state of Israel in 1948 to the travail that Israel is experiencing right now and the latter-day signs. I'm an historic premillennialist. So when I look at the Romans passages, I see an ongoing promise to Israel. The Israel of God, in one sense, is all the redeemed people of God. But the gospel came to the Jew first as well as to the Gentile. And there are promises given to Israel that the Lord himself says are irrevocable promises. And we understand that ultimately all of those are fulfilled in Christ. There are territorial promises and historic promises in space, time, and history that have not yet been realized, that I believe will be. I believe in a space-time history, literal physical rule of the Lord Jesus Christ from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. I believe that there will be a return of the Jewish people to Israel, a turn of the Jewish people. So when we talk about all Israel shall be saved, I see that as the same distinction in the Old Testament that is implied by what we describe as the doctrine of election. There is an Israel inside Israel. This does not mean all persons who are genetically Jewish. It means those who are, by God's grace, in the redemptive purposes of God, I think there'll be a massive turn to Christ among many Jewish people as one of the signs of the last things. So I think there are territorial promises given to Israel, spiritual Israel, that have not yet been fulfilled. The thing that's crucial here is that you have to decide what 1948 means. And so there are a lot of evangelicals who say 1948 means nothing biblically, means nothing historically. It means something to world politics, to the United Nations, and to world affairs. It doesn't mean anything theologically. I believe it does mean something theologically. I'm not a dispensationalist who says I believe that establishes a clock. Because I'm not going to say that the state of Israel that's at war right now is the Israel of God. But I do hold to a position that British evangelicals and a lot of American Protestants held at the time, and I think is right, that Israel is a providential nation, which right now is a means of preserving the Jewish people. And the law of return in Israel is a sign of that any Jewish person may come to Israel for safety. I believe that it's a providential nation in the sense of the preservation of the Jewish people for God's redemptive purposes in the age to come. And so is there a permanent distinction? Not in terms of grace. But I still believe that there is a privileged position in understanding the priority and sequence of God's redemptive purposes when we talk about the book of Hebrews, Moses and Abraham and Jacob. So that there's a lot more to be said here, but I appreciate the fact we can lay out and say, eschatology matters.
Absolutely.
And our understanding, hermeneutic of the Old and New Covenants matters, and it matters in terms of how we see the headlines of world history.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. Dr. Ibrahim, next question's for you. Help us understand the broader kind of powder keg Middle East situation. And what I'm going to ask is if Israel does a ground invasion, is this going to provoke a broader Middle East conflict with other nations opening up a multi-front war on Israel. And you have a column we plan to run tomorrow talking about a Hamas figure who's calling for a global jihad of sorts. So just help us understand the broader Middle East question around this.
I'm not a prophet, but things don't seem really okay. And this war will continue for some time. Let me briefly explain what's going on. In the past century, there were two major countries that reconciled with Israel. Reconcile in terms of politics means normalization. To some extent, so these two Arab nations, mostly Muslims, reconciled with Israel, that's Egypt and Jordan. In the previous US administration, there was a lot of push to make more countries reconcile or normalize relationships with Israel. So under the previous administration, we had the Abraham Accords, which included Bahrain and Emirates and Morocco, to some extent Sudan, and that was really wonderful initiative. And we all hoped that many more Arab Muslim countries will reconcile with Israel and have some sort of normal relationships. The most important Muslim country in the region is Saudi Arabia. Wealthy, and they have the oil power, and they are very central and crucial in this. So the idea of Saudi Arabia normalize relationships with Israel was a huge under the previous administration and continues under the current US administration. Now, what happened last weekend when Hamas invaded the Israeli territory, actually there is a lot of indicators that Iran is at the back of the scene. And Iran is to some extent the rival of Saudi Arabia. So we can actually see what happened last weekend in terms of a fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two Muslim nations, one Shiite and one Sunni. And even though in the recent past they were really coming together and trying to make some sort of peace together, what happened last weekend is an attempt from Iran to spoil any kind of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So this is what's happening in the region. And what really concerns me is that even though Israel is in good terms with Egypt and Jordan, anytime with all these moving pieces, something can happen and Israel becomes in like a big fight with either country. So the situation is really on hot ground. So if that's answering.
So I got to be honest with you, I have been absolutely shocked at the response, the failure to condemn that I've seen in many areas in the American left right now. What have we learned about American culture that many of our most elite sectors of culture are unwilling to condemn the atrocities that have happened on Saturday? Oh, begin with Dr. Muller, sure.
Yeah, let me, if I could just step back a moment and say, I believe all civilized nations have to support Israel in this contest, in this challenge, in this war. Because we really are looking at the forces of civilization versus the forces that would undo civilization. So before we get to any theological issue, I think many nations in the world, including European nations, just recognize that this threat against Israel is a threat against civilization. Now, we see it as more than that, or at least I see it as much more than that. But you're looking at a brutal invasion launched. You're talking about people massacred, 260 at least at a music festival. You're talking about beheadings. You're talking about the taking of hostages, children pulled away from their parents killed. You're talking about grandmothers slain, their bodies carried. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that any civilized society would have to denounce as wrong in every way, never excusable. This is even by whether it's just war theory or just basic moral instinct. This is horrible and unacceptable. But you know, there are some on the left in Europe and in the United States who have justified this. You know, student organizations, more than 30 at Harvard, more than 50 at the University of California at Berkeley, they've simply taken sides with the Palestinian cause here, which they're suggesting. And they're saying the Palestinian people have been oppressed. They're right about that. The Palestinian people have been oppressed. They've been oppressed by history. They've been oppressed by other Arab nations that would not receive them and have used them as pawns. Are they oppressed by Israel? To some extent, yes. Because one of the most horrible parts of Israel's quandary is that it is surrounded by enemies who embed jihadists with civilians. And that is a horrifying situation. And such that Israel has had to worry, for decades that a 13-year-old coming over the border may be wearing a bomb. Now, I'm going to say of that 13-year-old, there's maybe some moral responsibility there. I'm going to say more likely the moral responsibility is on those who took a 13-year-old and trained him in this atrocious worldview and strapped a bomb on him and sent him in. So in other words, yes, I believe the Palestinian people are oppressed, and I think we should understand that oppression. There are many grievances that go back to 1947, 1948, when many Palestinians lost their land for the establishment of Israel. Long resentments, many of which can be understood, but we're looking at the most vexing situation on planet Earth I know of. I'll just admit that. You try to understand how could Israel act, and I believe it is one of the most vexing issues faced by any nation. I do not believe, however, we can question Israel's right to defend its existence and to protect its people. And that's why you have even governments which have equivocated on so many different issues. You had a clear statement from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, who hasn't been clear on a lot of things and is clearly wrong on a long list of things. He said this is sheer evil, and he was absolutely right about that. The appearance of Anthony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv just in the last 24 hours or so, that sends a very clear signal. It is because even if you have no biblical or theological stake in this, you understand that if this kind of thing can go on in Israel, it can go on in Paris, it can go on in Canada, it can go on anywhere. And so there's a sense in which we understand, yes, there are also Christian Palestinians. In fact, the Christians in the Holy Land are more likely to be Palestinians. I believe they are also horribly oppressed by Hamas. And I pray for my brothers and sisters in Christ who are there. And there are many more than are known Jewish people who are also believers. But the majority believers are Palestinians. And we need to pray for their protection. We need to pray for the success of, and for the faithfulness and for the perseverance of Christians in the context here, for the preaching of the gospel. And we have to pray for their preservation. This is a complicated situation. But the one thing we know is that a group driven by Islamist ideology that comes in to murder babies, children, and grandmothers is demonstrating an evil that every single civilized person on earth must condemn in unequivocal terms. And if that isn't possible at Harvard, then everlasting shame upon Harvard. And, it's one thing to say this is complicated and vexing, and Israel has a responsibility to try to preserve civilian life, but to make the kind of statements that have been made of late just demonstrates the complete and utter moral evacuation and surrender of so many on the left in this country.
I think I agree with Dr. Moeller, and the oppressor, I would call this the oppressor of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is Hamas. And we should all acknowledge that, because many of the Palestinians, Muslims or non-Muslims, who live in the region are powerless. They can do nothing. Like, think about this strategically or politically. What Hamas did last weekend is suicidal. Like, they took a step that made, if they had a cause and support internationally, many people now, they don't want to support Hamas. But the problem happened is that they didn't care about their own people. They don't care. And I want to affirm what Dr. Muller was saying about our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters. Because in Gaza, there are some Catholics, Orthodox, and very little group of evangelicals. What are they doing now? They are really in a bad situation. And I know of many people who serve in that region, and it's really a disastrous situation for them. Many of them try to get some okay from the Hamas people to leave the strip, the Gaza Strip, and once they leave, they don't want to go back. So we need also to recognize that the picture is, the oppressor over there is mainly the people who are claiming to rule, and they are using people as like human shields and all this. So in the buildings, because they know that Israel will not bomb these buildings if it's full of people, they hide things and they put a lot of people and they hide the weaponry in the buildings, because they know it will be a hesitation on the part of Israel to do anything. So the situation is pretty dark. Yeah.
So let's talk real quick about the Christian just war tradition. In light of those principles and that framework, is Israel justified not only for retaliation, but is it justified for a ground invasion of Gaza, based on your analysis? Dr. Muller?
Christian just war theory has two parts. Number one, when military action is justified, and then secondly, if justified, how is it justly carried out? So I'm going to say it's really clear that when you are attacked, the just criteria for fighting back are clearly met. Any nation, by the way, that does not respond in a forceful way to this kind of action will cease to exist as a nation. In terms of how war is carried out, just war theory says you have to discriminate, to seek to preserve civilian life, and to target where just combatants. Over the course of history, evil actors have learned how to complicate that by intermingling combatants with non-combatants. Israel has faced this going all the way back to 1948. And so whenever Israel acts to preserve itself, and by the way, Israel, just like the United States, makes mistakes and bad judgments in the prosecution of war, which is a horrible business. But when when the international community says, well, now you have innocent people who are at risk, I just have to come back and say it's Hamas who put those innocent people at risk. Israel has no choice. This is a massive failure of the much vaunted Israeli military intelligence. It's also a massive failure of American military intelligence. Somehow Hamas built up a massive force with not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of rockets, armed forces with trained militia, parasails in which there was an aerial invasion. All of this had to be stored. Well, there aren't military storehouses in Gaza. These things were being stored in apartment complexes. And you notice one of the first things that Israel targeted was mosques, because the mosque had been transformed into organizing, units for the storing of weapons and the rest. So I recoil at the danger, and any Christian should, according to Christian theological principles, we should recoil at any endangering of civilian populations. We believe every single human being is made in God's image, and those who are trapped within the context of war, Israel bears a moral responsibility to seek to minimize injury and casualties among civilians to the utmost. Israel is going to respond. We have to defeat Hamas. And right now, by the way, Israel is politically divided in so many different ways, but Israel is now, at least on this cause, completely united. And when you have the American Secretary of State showing up of a Democratic administration like the Biden administration saying you have America's full support, and when you have Europeans who have wanted to find a way not to support Israel, who are now avidly, loudly supporting Israel, they understand that if Israel does not eliminate the threat of Hamas, this is going to be a permanent war. So we need to pray for those civilians. There is moral responsibility for endangering them. The first responsibility goes to Hamas for endangering them, because Hamas, by one estimation, has launched this horrifying war and has conducted atrocities the likes of which the world hasn't seen since the Holocaust, in order to lure Israel into a situation in which it will be seen as a pariah among the civilized nations of the earth. And I think one of the things we need to point out is that, just stating this bluntly, if this were the United States in this predicament, the United States would respond, and the American people would demand the United States respond in a way that would clearly defend the existence of the United States and the right of the United States to protect its own people. There would be no question. I think even in a nation like France, Emmanuel Macron has to now know that if this happened in France, the vengeance and wrath, the righteous wrath of the French people would demand an end to this threat. And so this is beyond our ability. We have to pray that the Lord will vindicate right and preserve human life in a situation in which Hamas has now made it a methodology to put rockets in apartment buildings, to store rockets under cribs, and to put arms into mosques. And this is going to be a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to see. And we need to pray that the Lord will do something beyond what is humanly possible in this to vindicate right and justice and peace.
Well, thank you for everyone who's been on the panel today. My last question was going to be, what can we be doing as Christians? And you already hinted at the fact that we need to be praying. And so to conclude our chapel time together, Dr. Schreiner, would you be willing to pray for this conflict, pray for wisdom for Israel's leaders, pray for the most minimal loss of life as possible? But would you pray for us and